All right, y'all, before we get started, there's going to be two separate PowerPoints. So in between, I'm going to have to close one and open the other. So just bear with me while that happens. But the first half of our notes is about women's suffrage. Your essential question to write at the top of your page or in your notebook is, what is the 19th Amendment and how has it changed American society? Traditional women, so women in their traditional roles. In the past, the U.S. was patriarchal, meaning men held all the positions of authority. Women were considered inferior. They lacked the right to vote, to serve on juries, or to hold public offices. They were excluded from public life and were left in charge of the home and children. In most states, once a woman was married, she lost control of her property and wages to her husband. By the middle of the 19th century, some women began to organize. In 1848, they held a convention in Seneca Falls, New York. This convention passed a resolution paraphrasing the Declaration of Independence. It proclaimed that women were equal to men and therefore deserved the right to vote. After the Civil War, women reformers hoped that freed slaves and women would be enfranchised at the same time. Women reformers were bitterly disappointed when the 14th and 15th Amendments gave citizenship and the right to vote, or suffrage, to male freedmen, but not to women. Susan B. Anthony. In 1872, Susan B. Anthony, a prominent reformer, attempted to vote in Rochester, New York, on the grounds that she was a citizen and had that right under the 14th Amendment. However, a judge refused to grant her that right. In 1874, the Supreme Court then ruled that although women were citizens, they could not vote. Voting, according to the court, was not necessarily a privilege of citizenship. The fact that women did not have suffrage continued to be seen as a symbol of their inferior status and a violation of basic democratic principles. Anthony and other women reformers were able to obtain suffrage in a number of Western states, but they could never succeed in introducing a constitutional amendment requiring all states to give women the vote. By 1890, the failure to achieve women's suffrage led several women's groups to merge together into the National American Women's Suffrage Association under the leadership of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. The 19th Amendment. During World War I, as men went off to Europe to fight for democracy, millions of women took their places working in factories, mills, and mines. It seemed odd to many to fight for democracy in other countries, but to oppose it at home. During World War I, it became hard for opponents of women's suffrage to deny that women were the equals of men. As a result, shortly after America's entry into the war, a proposed amendment was introduced in Congress. This amendment established that no state could deny a citizen the right to vote on the basis of sex. It was ratified as the 19th Amendment to the Constitution in 1920. The impact of the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment was a step forward in making the United States a true democracy, a system of government by the people. It did not lead to the dramatic changes to our political system that many of its opponents had predicted. The fear that men would be swept out of office and replaced by women did not materialize. In fact, few women, then and even now, were elected to political office. The amendment also failed to bring about the equality of economic opportunity between the sexes that some of its sponsors had hoped for. Most women continued to face discrimination and were paid much less for the same work than their male counterparts. The progressive movement comes to an end. The passage of women's suffrage was the last notable reform of the progressive era. By 1920, the force of the progressive movement had spent itself. Americans had met many of the challenges posed by industrialization and were once again poised for economic growth. All right, y'all give me 1 second. All right, American literature and art. This essential question is, how was the move toward realism reflected in American art and literature? The basics. The late 19th century was one of the most fertile periods of American literature. As the nation grew, the increasing rates of literacy, the rapid growth in urbanization, a rising population, and an increase in middle-class affluence provided a fertile environment for readers interested in understanding these rapid shifts in culture. The prevalence of newspapers and magazines, as well as cheap dime novels, created a market for literacy works. Improvements in transportation and communications made it easier to travel and to share experiences. American writers were also deeply influenced by European novelists. Realism. During these years, realism, defined as nothing more or less than the truthful treatment of material, was the leading literary fashion. Realists described life with as much detail as they could. Realism provided an opportunity to show the impact of industrialization and social change on people. Different writers. Just after the Civil War, the novels of Horatio Alger praised hard work and discipline and saw wealth as a sign of divine favor. His first novel, Ragged Dick, was his most popular and remained in print for the next 40 years. The story of each novel was simple. A poor boy with few prospects significantly improves his position in life due to hard work and help from adults. Henry James. The greatest master of the psychological novel was Henry James. Each of his novels usually unfolds through the consciousness of the main character. His stories often depicted America's wealthy upper classes. James also focused on the differences between America and Europe. For example, The Portrait of a Lady is about a penniless orphan taken to England by a rich aunt. She marries the wrong man and has to accept the consequences of her decision. Mark Twain. The novels of Mark Twain reflected the differences between pre-Civil War society and afterward. Twain associated the Old South with romanticism and the present with realism. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer described his childhood adventures in fictional form. The Gilded Age depicted the boom times after the Civil War and gave a name to a historical period. His greatest work, Huckleberry Finn, treated the moral conflicts created by slavery. Twain's use of regional accents gave his works a sense of realism. Kate Chopin was a notable woman novelist. The Awakening depicts the conflict between our inward and outward lives. The main character is a respected wife and mother who leads a routine life. Suddenly she awakens one summer when she falls in love and discovers passion before committing suicide. The book caused a scandal and was banned from many libraries across the nation. Moving on to art. As in literature, realism was the main style in the visual arts in these years. Among the best-known American artists of this period were Whistler, Eakins, and Homer. James McNeill Whistler moved to Europe, where he was influenced by modern French painters. He created some of the finest paintings in American art, such as his portrait of his mother. Winslow Homer is known for paintings featuring scenes of the sea, boats, and coastlines. Thomas Eakins was another realist painter who made portraits of friends, family, and people in the arts, sciences, and medicine. The Gross Clinic is often considered his finest painting. It shows Dr. Gross performing surgery on a young man, while the patient's mother cringes in the corner. Depicted in a surgical amphitheater, the viewer appears to occupy a seat alongside Gross's students. One of Eakins' students, Henry Osawa Tanner, was one of the most important African American painters in this time period. His paintings focused on everyday scenes like a banjo lesson. Other painters in this period focused on the American West. Frederick Remington and Charles Russell painted and sculpted cowboys, Native American Indians, and landscapes and romanticized scenes of life in the American West. Thanks, y'all.